False alarm. This video is based on key insights from the book False Alarm by Bjorn Lomborg. Introduction. Bjorn Lomborg believes that many people are very worried about climate change, and the news often makes it seem like the world is ending. He points out that a common image is a girl holding a sign saying she'll die of climate change, while others will die of old age. Lomborg thinks this kind of message, and many others like it, create unnecessary fear. News stories talk about the planet burning up and suggest humanity might disappear in just a few decades. He says this language is too extreme and doesn't match what scientists are actually saying. Lomborg explains that while climate change is a real problem, it's not the end of the world. He's been studying climate change for 20 years and says the basic facts haven't changed much. Scientists agree that humans are causing the planet to warm, but the impacts they predict are not as scary as some people believe. He argues that the way we're talking about climate change has become much more dramatic and less based on science. He's concerned that this panic leads to bad decisions. People are choosing not to have children because they're afraid of the future, and kids are skipping school to protest. Lomborg believes we're wasting a lot of money on solutions that don't really work. He calls it going from spending billions on ineffective ideas to potentially wasting trillions. This also means we're ignoring other important problems like diseases, hunger, and conflicts. Lomborg points out that many books and articles exaggerate the dangers of climate change. He mentions books with titles like The Uninhabitable Earth and Storms of My Grandchildren, which paint a very bleak picture. Even news organizations are using stronger words like climate emergency and climate crisis to get people's attention. He thinks this kind of language is misleading and makes people unnecessarily scared. He shares that polls show many people believe the world is getting worse, and almost half think climate change will end humanity. This fear has real consequences. It makes people pessimistic and distracts us from solving other problems. Lomborg argues that we need to calm down and look at the science and the costs of different solutions. Lomborg emphasizes that the world is actually getting better in many ways. People are living longer, healthier lives, and poverty is decreasing. He says that since 1900, life expectancy has more than doubled. He believes that as people become richer, they are better able to deal with challenges like climate change. He highlights that the predicted impact of climate change on the global economy by the end of the century is relatively small, around 3.6% of global GDP. He suggests that instead of focusing on drastic measures that could hurt the world's poorest, we should invest in new technologies. He believes that spending money on research and development for things like cleaner energy sources could be much more effective than current policies. He also thinks we should focus on helping people adapt to the changes that are already happening, like building better flood defenses or developing drought-resistant crops. Lomborg argues that many climate policies are unfair because they hurt the poor the most. When energy becomes more expensive, it's harder for low-income families to afford basic necessities. He also believes that focusing so much on climate change means we're neglecting other important issues that could improve the lives of billions of people, especially in developing countries. He suggests that helping these countries become wealthier and healthier is the best way to address climate change in the long run. Ultimately, Lomborg wants people to understand that climate change is a problem we can manage. He believes we need to be realistic about the costs and benefits of different solutions and focus on smart, innovative approaches that will make the world a better place for everyone. He encourages us to stop panicking and start working together to find practical solutions. Chapter 1: Why do we get climate change so wrong? Bjorn Lomborg argues that a lot of the worry about climate change comes from how the media, campaigners, and politicians talk about it. He believes they often make things sound scarier than they are to get attention or funding. Lomborg points out that people have always dealt with changes in the Earth's climate, and they will continue to do so. He thinks that many predictions about the effects of climate change don't consider this important fact, that humans are adaptable. Lomborg explains that there's a reason why scary stories about climate change get so much attention. News outlets get more readers when they report frightening news. Groups trying to raise awareness about climate change get more donations. And scientists who focus on the most dramatic possibilities might get more money for their research. Politicians can use these fears to promise solutions and gain power. He isn't saying we shouldn't be concerned, but that we should be realistic and skeptical. He suggests that selling a story of total disaster is useful for all these groups. The author focuses on the media's role, stating that they often choose the most alarming version of the climate change story because it attracts more readers. He uses an example of a news story claiming that human civilization could end by 2050, based on a short, little-known report. Lomborg explains that this report used extreme scenarios and wasn't well reviewed by other scientists. He argues that the media often doesn't fully check the information they report, prioritizing clicks and views over accuracy. Lomborg believes the media was once too quick to give a platform to people who denied climate change was happening. Now, he thinks they sometimes go too far in the other direction, exaggerating the dangers. He points to a Time magazine cover featuring the UN Secretary General standing in water in Tuvalu, a small island nation, with a story warning it would disappear under the sea. However, Lomborg explains that recent research actually shows Tuvalu is growing in size due to a process called accretion, where coral and sand build up the land. He provides similar examples from Kiribati and the Marshall Islands, showing that these islands are also gaining land despite rising sea levels. He continues by explaining that even when studies show potential problems, like areas being underwater, the media often ignores the fact that people can adapt. He uses the example of Vietnam, where much of the land is already below sea level but is protected by dikes. He argues that focusing on the scary possibility of flooding without mentioning the existing protection is misleading. He emphasizes that humans have a history of building defenses against water, like the dikes in Holland and London. Lomborg also criticizes the tendency to set artificial deadlines for climate action, like the claim that we have only 12 years to avert catastrophe. He points out that similar deadlines have been set and missed in the past, often without any real consequences. He argues that these deadlines are used to create a sense of urgency and justify extreme measures. He notes that the UN's 2018 report, which was widely reported as a call for drastic action, was actually a response to a request from world leaders to figure out what it would take to meet an already ambitious goal. He highlights how climate change has become a political issue, with Democrats and Republicans in the United States increasingly divided on the topic. He argues that this polarization can lead to exaggerated claims and a lack of constructive dialogue. He also points out that some media outlets have portrayed China as a leader in climate action, despite the country being the world's largest carbon emitter. Lomborg stresses that adaptation is a crucial part of dealing with climate change, and that it's often overlooked. He explains that as societies become wealthier, they are better able to adapt to changing conditions, such as building stronger defenses against floods and heat waves. He argues that focusing solely on reducing carbon emissions without considering adaptation is a mistake. He uses the example of heat waves, explaining that if people buy air conditioners, the number of deaths from heat could actually decrease, even with rising temperatures. Finally, Lomborg argues that the increasing cost of climate-related disasters is not necessarily due to climate change itself, but rather to the fact that more people and property are located in vulnerable areas. He calls this the expanding bullseye effect. He concludes that we need to stop the sensationalism and focus on realistic solutions that consider both reducing emissions and helping people adapt to the changes that are already happening. He believes that a more balanced approach will be more effective and less frightening. Chapter 2: Measuring the Future. Bjorn Lomborg begins by explaining that when we talk about climate change and our future, it's important to have ways to measure both the problem and how we're doing. He points out that we often use temperature and how wealthy a country is measured by something called gross domestic product, or GDP, as those measurements. He admits these aren't perfect, but they're the best tools we have right now. Climate change isn't just about the temperature going up. It's about things like floods, droughts, and storms. But scientists often use the change in global temperature as a simple way to show the overall impact. Similarly, GDP helps us understand how well people are living, even though it doesn't measure happiness or health directly. The problem is that these two things are connected. Trying to stop the temperature from rising costs money, which can slow down how quickly a country's economy grows. On the other hand, when a country gets richer, it often uses more energy, which releases more gases that warm the planet. So, understanding both temperature and GDP, and how they affect each other, is key to figuring out what the future might hold. Lomborg explains that scientists have known for a long time that more carbon dioxide in the air makes the Earth warmer. This gas comes mostly from burning things like coal, oil, and gas to create energy. As the world has used more and more of these fuels, carbon dioxide levels have gone up a lot. Carbon dioxide acts like a blanket around the Earth, letting sunlight in but trapping some of the heat. This is similar to how a greenhouse works, keeping plants warm. The more carbon dioxide, the warmer the Earth gets. Even though oceans and forests absorb some of this gas, the amount in the atmosphere keeps increasing. He uses a bathtub analogy to help understand this. Imagine the atmosphere is a bathtub, and carbon dioxide is the water. Every year, we pour more water into the tub. The drain oceans and forests lets some water out, but not all of it. So the water level, the amount of carbon dioxide, keeps rising. Even if we slow down how much water we pour in, the tub will still fill up. We need to almost stop pouring water in completely for the water level to start going down. To understand how much the temperature will rise, scientists use big computer programs that model the Earth's climate. These programs are very complicated, but they help predict what will happen based on how much carbon dioxide we release. Lomborg uses a simpler model called MAGICC, which focuses on carbon dioxide and temperature. He uses data from the United Nations to predict future emissions, assuming things continue as they are now. This middle-of-the-road scenario suggests that carbon dioxide levels will more than double this century, leading to a temperature increase of 7.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Lomborg then explores what would happen if the richest countries suddenly stopped using fossil fuels. Surprisingly, it wouldn't make a huge difference. Even if these countries stopped all their emissions, the overall amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would still rise, and the temperature would still increase, just by a little less. He points out that the United States alone emits over 40% of the rich world's carbon dioxide, so even if the US stopped completely, the global temperature would only be slightly cooler. Next, Lomborg shifts to the economic side, explaining what GDP is. It's basically a measure of how much a country produces and sells. While some people think using money to measure well-being is flawed, Lomborg argues that GDP is a useful indicator. He explains that richer countries tend to have healthier people, better education, and lower death rates. Economic growth has helped lift millions of people out of poverty and improve their lives. However, Lomborg acknowledges that economic growth also leads to more carbon dioxide emissions. As countries become wealthier, they use more energy. But he also points out that as people become richer, they often demand a cleaner environment. They want less pollution, more forests, and cleaner water. He explains that poverty is often a major cause of pollution, and as people escape poverty, they tend to improve the environment. He also shares research showing that people are generally happier in richer countries. Even as incomes rise, people report greater satisfaction with their lives. This suggests that GDP is a good measure of overall well-being, as it reflects not just wealth, but also health, education, and happiness. Lomborg concludes by saying that while economic growth will continue to improve lives and lift people out of poverty, it will also lead to more carbon dioxide emissions and warming. He believes we need to find a balance between these two things, reducing emissions to avoid the worst effects of climate change, while still allowing for economic growth and improving people's lives. He suggests that by finding the right balance, we can make the world a better place overall. Chapter 3, A Fuller Story on Climate Change. Bjorn Lomborg begins by pointing out that when we talk about climate change, there's a common story we all seem to hear. This story says that global warming makes everything worse: more floods, more droughts, and generally a bleaker future. Lomborg argues this is an oversimplified, almost cartoonish view of a very complex issue. He explains that most things in life have both good and bad sides, and climate change is no different. Lomborg emphasizes that while climate change certainly has downsides, it also has some unexpected upsides. For example, while more rain can cause floods, it can also help end droughts. He notes that when scientists look at the big picture, they find that increased rainfall usually helps with droughts more than it causes flooding, largely because humans use a lot of the extra water for farming and industry. He isn't saying we shouldn't be worried about climate change, but that we need a more complete understanding of what's happening. He believes the common narrative paints a scary picture of widespread death and societal collapse, but this is an exaggeration. To illustrate his point, Lomborg focuses on the image of the polar bear. This animal has become a symbol of climate change, often shown stranded on melting ice. He acknowledges that polar bears are wonderful creatures, and we don't want them to disappear. However, he points out that polar bears have survived warmer periods in the past, and that hunting was actually a bigger threat to their population for a long time. In fact, the polar bear population is currently growing, and is at its highest recorded level. Because of this, environmental groups and news outlets have quietly stopped using the polar bear as a central image in their climate change messaging. Lomborg argues that focusing on the polar bear distracts from the real threats to wildlife, like habitat loss and overhunting, which account for the vast majority of species endangerment. Lomborg then turns to the topic of heat waves, which are often presented as a terrifying consequence of climate change. While he agrees that heat waves are dangerous, he points out that cold weather is actually far more deadly. A large study found that cold temperatures cause 17 times more deaths than heat. He explains that heat kills quickly, while cold causes deaths over a longer period and therefore receives less attention. He uses the example of India, where more people die from cold than from heat, but the media focuses primarily on heat wave deaths. Lomborg suggests that if we focus solely on heat-related deaths, we might miss opportunities to protect people from the more significant threat of cold. The author then discusses the surprising phenomenon of global greening. Despite the narrative of a dying planet, the Earth is actually becoming greener, with plant life increasing across vast areas. Lomborg explains that this is largely due to carbon dioxide, the same gas that causes global warming. Plants need carbon dioxide to grow, so more of it in the atmosphere actually helps them thrive. He notes that the increase in greenery is equivalent to adding 2 entire continents' worth of plants and trees to the planet. While this doesn't negate the negative effects of climate change, it's a significant positive effect that is often overlooked. Finally, Lomborg challenges the idea that climate change causes war. He points to the Syrian civil war as an example often cited by activists, but argues that the conflict was caused by a complex mix of factors, including poor water management, population growth, and political issues. He explains that studies have actually shown a correlation between colder temperatures and increased conflict throughout history, as cold weather can lead to food shortages and social unrest. Lomborg concludes that climate change is only one of many factors that can contribute to conflict, and is often not the most important one. Lomborg's overall message is that the current narrative around climate change is too one-sided and alarmist. He believes that by focusing only on the negative aspects, we are not well informed and are making poor decisions. He urges us to consider the full picture, including the potential benefits of a warmer world, and to prioritize solutions that address the most pressing threats to both people and the planet. Chapter 4, extreme weather, or extreme exaggeration. Bjorn Lomborg argues that the way we talk about climate change and what we do about it isn't always the best way to help the planet or the people who need it most. He believes that the constant worry and panic surrounding climate change can actually be harmful, costing us a lot of money and not really solving the problem. He points out that the media often focuses on the worst possible scenarios, like huge floods, raging fires, and powerful hurricanes. These stories make us feel scared and like things are getting much worse. But Lomborg says that when scientists, like those at the United Nations, carefully look at the facts, the picture isn't always as gloomy as it seems. He explains that sometimes, what we hear in the news doesn't match what the data actually shows. For example, even though many people think droughts are becoming more common, scientists haven't found strong evidence that there are more droughts happening around the world. In some places, like parts of North America, droughts might even be decreasing. Lomborg uses the example of crime to explain this. He says that people often believe crime is getting worse, even though statistics show it's actually going down. This is because the news always reports on the bad crimes, making it seem like they are happening more often. He thinks the same thing is happening with climate change. We hear about the worst events, which makes us think everything is getting much worse. He also talks about how people's beliefs about climate change can be influenced by their political views. People who are worried about climate change are more likely to believe that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and intense. Those who aren't as worried might remember past events that were even worse. Lomborg thinks it's important to base our actions on facts, not just feelings. When it comes to droughts, Lomborg explains that scientists haven't found a strong link between human-caused climate change and the increase in droughts. He points out that even if carbon emissions do increase a lot, it's likely that droughts will only get worse in already dry areas, and that, too, will happen much later in the future. He emphasizes that we can do a lot to manage water resources and protect ourselves from drought, even without drastically reducing carbon emissions. For example, California uses reservoirs to reduce the impact of droughts, and careful water use can shorten how long a drought lasts. He then moves on to flooding, noting that scientists are unsure if flooding is actually getting more common worldwide. While some areas might experience more flooding, others don't. Lomborg argues that when we hear about devastating floods, it's often because more people and valuable buildings are being built in flood-prone areas. He uses the example of rising flood costs in the United States. While the dollar amount of flood damage has increased, this is largely because there are more houses and businesses in areas that flood. When you consider the size of the economy, the cost of flooding hasn't actually increased as much as it seems. Lomborg also addresses wildfires, explaining that while they can be scary, the amount of land burned globally has actually decreased over the past century. He says that human activities, like clearing land for farming, have helped reduce wildfires. He also points out that more homes are being built in areas prone to wildfires, which increases the damage when fires occur. Finally, he discusses hurricanes. While some people believe hurricanes are becoming more powerful because of climate change, Lomborg says that scientists haven't found strong evidence to support this. He argues that the increased cost of hurricanes is mainly due to more people living in coastal areas and building expensive homes. He believes that focusing on helping the world's poorest people, who are most vulnerable to extreme weather, is a better way to address the problem than simply trying to reduce carbon emissions. Lomborg concludes that while climate change is a real issue, the way we're approaching it is often misguided. He suggests that instead of panicking and spending trillions of dollars on unrealistic solutions, we should focus on practical, cost-effective measures that can help people adapt to climate change and improve their lives. He believes that smart investments in things like disaster preparedness, water management, and poverty reduction will do more to protect the planet and its people than drastic cuts in carbon emissions alone. Chapter 5: What is global warming going to cost us? Bjorn Lomborg begins by explaining that understanding the true cost of global warming is super important. If the damage is huge, we should definitely spend a lot of money trying to stop it. But if the cost is smaller, we need to be careful that the solutions don't end up causing more problems than the warming itself. He introduces William Nordhaus, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who has spent decades studying the economics of climate change. Nordhaus figured out a way to estimate how much different impacts of climate change, like problems with farming, energy, forests, and rising sea levels, will cost the world. Lomborg explains that economists like Nordhaus use computer models to make these estimates. They feed in lots of information about how warming temperatures might affect things like how much food we can grow, how much energy we use, and how often we get big storms. These models aren't perfect, but they're very detailed and have been tested over and over again. They even try to account for things like diseases spreading more easily and people having to move because of climate change. Some models even consider really scary possibilities, like the Greenland ice sheet melting quickly. The big takeaway, according to Lomborg, is that the cost of climate change, while real, is likely to be moderate when looked at as a percentage of the entire world's economy. He points out that many studies show the impact will be significant, but not catastrophic. Right now, the planet has warmed a little less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Some studies even suggest that this amount of warming might have a small positive effect, while others show a slight negative impact. But as temperatures rise further, the negative effects become more clear. Lomborg highlights that if temperatures rise about 7 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, which is likely if we don't do anything more to reduce emissions, the world's economy could be about 2.9% smaller than it would have been otherwise. Lomborg acknowledges that this might sound surprisingly low, given all the scary news about climate change. He argues that a lot of what we hear in the media is misleading. He explains that the models often don't fully account for how people and countries will adapt to the changes. People aren't just going to sit back and let climate change ruin their lives. They'll find ways to cope. He uses agriculture as an example. While climate change will make it harder to grow food in some places, farmers are already finding ways to adapt, like planting different crops or changing when they plant. Plus, carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, also acts like a fertilizer for plants, helping them grow bigger and faster. Many studies don't include this fertilization effect, which makes the problem seem worse than it is. Lomborg points out that even with climate change, food production is still expected to increase, just not as much as it could have. He shares that a UN study predicted that climate change might reduce crop output by only a tiny fraction of a percent by mid-century. Lomborg then addresses the possibility of really big, unexpected disasters. He explains that Nordhaus added a 25% buffer to his estimates to account for any unknown costs. Even with this buffer, the estimated cost of climate change remains relatively moderate, around 4% of global GDP. He discusses concerns like the Greenland ice sheet melting and ocean acidification, explaining that while these are serious issues, their economic impact is likely to be smaller than many people fear. Finally, Lomborg emphasizes that the economic models used to estimate the cost of climate change are comprehensive and based on the best available science. He suggests that while the exact cost is uncertain, it's unlikely to be dramatically higher or lower than the estimates provided by economists like Nordhaus. He concludes that understanding these costs is crucial for making smart decisions about how to address climate change. Chapter 6: You Can't Fix Climate Change. Bjorn Lomborg begins by pointing out that lots of people and companies are trying to help the planet by doing things like buying carbon offsets and using new technologies like electric cars and solar panels. Governments are also spending a lot of money, maybe even trillions, to encourage these changes. But he argues that all this effort isn't working. He explains that carbon intensity is how much carbon dioxide is released when we make energy. If things were getting better, this number would be going down. Instead, it's going up. Even though countries have made promises to reduce emissions at big meetings like the ones in Kyoto and Paris, the problem is getting worse. We're using more energy than ever before, and each bit of energy we use releases more carbon dioxide. Because of this, we're putting more carbon dioxide into the air now than we ever have in history. And sadly, he says, even with all the focus on climate change in recent years, we haven't made much progress at all. The United Nations even admitted that a whole decade of climate policies didn't really achieve anything. Lomborg then asks, if all these efforts aren't working, why not? He starts by looking at the idea that individuals can make a big difference. We're often told to recycle, eat less meat, use public transportation, and carry reusable bags. People like David Attenborough say everyone needs to do their part. But Lomborg argues that these small changes don't really add up to much. He uses the example of David Attenborough unplugging his phone charger. While it's a good idea, it would only save a tiny amount of carbon dioxide each year, less than half of 1,000th of the average emissions for a person in the United Kingdom. He points out that most of a phone's energy use comes from making the phone and running the big computer centers that power the internet, not from charging it. To show how small these individual actions are, Lomborg uses a carbon trading system called RGGI. This system puts a price on carbon dioxide. It costs about $6 to buy permission to release 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So, Attenborough's phone charger savings would only cost a couple of cents on the RGGI market. It would be like donating that small amount to help the climate. Lomborg explains that most things we can do to reduce our emissions are small, and we often save money when we do them. This leads to something called the rebound effect. When we save money, we tend to spend it on something else, which can end up releasing more carbon dioxide. For example, if we reduce food waste and save money, we might spend that money on a vacation, which creates emissions. Sometimes, the rebound effect cancels out all the good we did. He also talks about moral licensing. This is when we feel like we can do something bad after doing something good. If we donate to charity, we might be more likely to waste energy. If we buy energy-saving light bulbs, we might use more water. It's like giving ourselves permission to be a little less careful. He shares a story about a man who spent a year trying to reduce his family's carbon footprint by insulating their house, selling their car, and cutting out meat. He managed to reduce their emissions by 20%. But to celebrate, he bought tickets for his family to travel to South America, which ended up using up all the carbon dioxide savings. Lomborg then looks at the idea of becoming a vegetarian. While it's a personal choice, he argues that it won't solve climate change. Many people who try to become vegetarians give up, and even if everyone did, it would only reduce global emissions by a small amount, about 2%. Plus, the rebound effect means we'd probably save even less. He also discusses electric cars. While they seem like a good idea, they aren't as helpful as we think. In many places, the electricity used to charge them comes from power plants that burn fossil fuels. Also, making electric cars, especially the batteries, uses a lot of energy. So, an electric car might only reduce emissions by 24% compared to a gasoline-powered car. And the government spends a lot of money subsidizing electric cars, more than it would cost to buy carbon offsets to make up for the emissions. Finally, Lomborg addresses the idea of having fewer children. Some people suggest that we shouldn't have children to help the planet. But Lomborg thinks this is unfair and unrealistic. He explains that calculations about the carbon footprint of having children are based on strange and exaggerated assumptions. He believes that people should be free to make their own choices about having families. Lomborg concludes that focusing on individual actions isn't the answer. He says we need to find better ways to address climate change, and he'll explore those ideas in the chapters that follow. He suggests that instead of telling people to change their lifestyles, we should focus on things like developing new technologies and making energy more efficient. Chapter 7: Why the Green Revolution Isn't Here Yet. Bjorn Lomborg argues that the world's efforts to fight climate change are often misguided and incredibly expensive. He points out that even after spending a huge amount of money, over $140 billion each year, On things like solar panels and wind turbines, these sources only provide about 1% of the world's energy. He believes that instead of making a real difference, this money is largely wasted. Lomborg explains that the energy we use today, often from fossil fuels like coal and oil, has helped countries develop and become wealthier for 200 years. He says that trying to completely stop using these fuels in just a few decades would cost hundreds of trillions of dollars. That's a lot of money, and he thinks most countries would have a hard time paying that much without upsetting their citizens. Poorer countries, he adds, don't have that kind of money to spare and would much rather have more energy to help their people improve their lives. He questions the idea that renewable energy sources like solar and wind are just around the corner from taking over. Even respected climate scientists, like Jim Hansen, who first warned the public about global warming, think it's unrealistic to believe that these sources will quickly replace fossil fuels. Lomborg highlights that most of the energy we currently get from renewable sources, about 85%, comes from older, reliable methods like wood and hydropower. Solar and wind power are tricky because they only work when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, making them unreliable on their own. To make solar and wind power more dependable, we need backup systems, like gas turbines that can turn on when the sun isn't out or wind isn't blowing, or large batteries to store energy. These backups add a lot to the cost. He emphasizes that we don't have enough batteries to store even a tiny amount of the electricity the United States uses, just about 14 seconds worth. Lomborg looks at the United States as an example. Even though wind and solar power have grown, they still only provide a small portion of the country's energy. Most of the renewable energy comes from hydroelectricity and wood. In fact, the share of renewable energy in the United States has actually decreased over the past century, only recently picking up a bit due to climate concerns, but still remaining far below what it was 100 years ago. He points out that politicians often promise 100% renewable energy by 2030 or 2050, but these promises aren't based on reality. He calls these claims unrealistic. Globally, solar panels and wind turbines only provide a tiny fraction of the world's energy, just 1.1%. Even by 2040, they're predicted to cover less than 5%. Lomborg argues that in poorer countries, the focus should be on providing more energy, even if it means using fossil fuels. He uses the example of China, which rapidly developed its economy by using coal power, lifting millions out of poverty. He also mentions South Africa's energy minister, who believes that energy is key to economic growth. He criticizes projects that try to bring solar power to poor villages, like one in India called Darnai. While well-intentioned, the solar system couldn't provide enough power for even basic needs like lighting and cooking. The villagers ended up needing diesel generators and eventually preferred to be connected to the main power grid, which uses coal. Similar problems have occurred in Fiji, where solar power couldn't handle the demand for refrigerators, leading people to buy diesel generators instead. Lomborg believes that solar panels often don't provide enough benefit to justify their cost, especially in poorer communities. Studies in Tanzania showed that most people would prefer to have access to the electric grid rather than solar panels. He criticizes policies in Europe, like Germany's Energiewende, which has spent a huge amount of money on renewable energy, but hasn't significantly reduced the use of fossil fuels. Electricity costs in Germany have doubled, and the country is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. The European Union has also spent a lot on climate policies, and electricity prices are rising. Lomborg concludes that the current approach to fighting climate change is not effective and is costing the world trillions of dollars. He suggests that instead of focusing on unrealistic goals and expensive solutions, we should focus on practical steps that can improve lives and protect the environment without breaking the bank. Chapter 8: Why the Paris Agreement is Failing. Bjorn Lomborg argues that the Paris Agreement on climate change, which many leaders celebrated as a huge step forward, is actually a costly mistake that won't do much to help the planet. He believes the agreement is based on promises made by different countries, and these promises vary greatly. Some countries pledged to reduce pollution a lot, while others made easier promises to keep. Essentially, the agreement is a collection of these different pledges. The problem, according to Lomborg, is that these promises cost a lot of money. To cut down on pollution, countries need to make people and businesses use different kinds of energy and technology, ones that don't release as much carbon dioxide. If these cleaner options were cheaper, people would naturally choose them. But because they aren't, governments have to force people to use them, which means higher prices. It's not as simple as just looking at taxes on energy. When the government spends money on things like solar panels and wind farms, that money doesn't just disappear. It gets used for other things, often benefiting the people who own those solar panels and wind farms. The real cost, Lomborg explains, is how higher energy prices affect everyone. When energy costs more, families and businesses have less money to spend on other things. This slows down the economy a little bit. He calls this the social cost of climate policies, the loss of well-being that comes from using energy that's more expensive and less reliable than traditional fuels. Lomborg points out that making things like food, houses, and transportation always creates pollution. It's just a natural part of producing things we want. So, when countries promise to reduce pollution, they're also promising to make those things a bit more expensive. This slows down economic growth, though it doesn't stop it completely. To figure out how much these policies cost, economists use special computer models. These models predict how the economy will grow with and without climate policies. The difference in growth shows the cost of the policies. However, Lomborg cautions that these models aren't perfect. Some might be too pessimistic, while others might be too optimistic. That's why it's best to use many different models and find an average. Lomborg focuses on the promises made by the United States, the European Union, China, and Mexico, because they account for about 80% of all the pollution reductions promised worldwide. He found that the United States promised to reduce pollution by a certain amount by 2025. Achieving this would cost the country between $154 billion and $172 billion each year by 2030. The European Union promised an even bigger cut, which would cost them around $322 billion annually. China's promise, while large, would only cost about $200 billion per year. Mexico's commitment is expected to cost around $80 billion each year. Adding up the costs for these four countries, Lomborg estimates that the Paris Agreement will cost the world about $924 billion each year by 2030. He believes this is likely an underestimate because politicians often make policies that are less efficient than they could be. For example, in Europe, politicians favored wind and solar power over cheaper alternatives, which made the policies more expensive. The same thing is happening in the United States, where some states are pushing for renewable energy even though it's more costly. Considering these inefficiencies, Lomborg suggests the agreement could actually cost the world between $1 trillion and $2 trillion each year. He emphasizes that this is a huge amount of money comparable to the entire world's military spending, or many times more than what's spent on fighting diseases like HIV/AIDS. Despite the enormous cost, Lomborg argues that the Paris Agreement will have a very small impact on the climate. Even if every country keeps its promises, the agreement is only expected to reduce the Earth's temperature by a tiny fraction of a degree by the end of the century. Many countries aren't even on track to meet their promises, and the agreement's supporters often exaggerate its potential benefits. Lomborg concludes that the Paris Agreement is a costly and ineffective solution to climate change. He believes that instead of wasting trillions of dollars on policies that won't make a big difference, we should focus on smart, cost-effective solutions that can actually improve people's lives while also addressing climate change. Chapter 9, Pick a Path. Which future is best? Bjorn Lomborg begins by posing a thought experiment. Imagine going back to 1940 and being able to slightly adjust the United States' economic growth rate. Even a tiny difference, 0.62 percentage points, would add up over 80 years, making people two-thirds richer. He argues that we face a similar choice today with climate policy, but the stakes are even higher, especially for the world's poorest people. Many leaders, influenced by climate activists, are choosing paths that could actually make things worse, costing the world a staggering $500 trillion per year and trapping people in poverty. Lomborg points out that for 3 decades, global efforts to cut carbon dioxide haven't really worked. Yet, the policies created to address climate change are already incredibly expensive. By 2030, the Paris Agreement alone could cost over $1 trillion annually, and this is just the beginning. He believes climate panic will end up costing humanity hundreds of trillions of dollars every year. This claim is based on research from the United Nations Climate Science Panel, the IPCC, which looked at 5 possible future scenarios. These scenarios considered things like global politics, economics, and population growth. The research shows that, no matter what happens, people will likely become wealthier over the next century. Over the last 200 years, the world has already seen a huge increase in wealth. However, how much wealthier people become depends on the path we choose. The worst scenario, called regional rivalry, involves countries focusing on their own problems and not working together. This leads to slow economic growth and worsening inequalities. Even in this scenario, though, the world would still be better off than it is today. Another bad outcome, inequality, sees a split between rich, educated countries and poor, less educated ones, with growing gaps in opportunity and increasing conflict. A middle-of-the-road scenario is the most likely, with slow but steady progress in areas like health and education. But the 2 best scenarios offer the most hope. 1, sustainable development, focuses on reducing environmental impact through things like less consumption and more investment in green technologies. The other, fossil-fueled development, prioritizes economic growth through innovation, investment in education and health, and utilizing fossil fuels. While this scenario leads to higher emissions, it also invests more in adapting to climate change and managing local pollution. Lomborg emphasizes that the fossil-fueled development scenario leads to significantly more wealth, 10 times the current level, compared to the sustainable development scenario, which offers 6 times the current level. Even when accounting for the costs of climate change, the fossil-fueled development pathway still results in $69,000 more welfare per person each year. He calculates that choosing the sustainable development path would effectively hold the world back by a generation, delaying the point at which global welfare reaches a certain level. The total cost of choosing the lower growth path is a staggering $509 trillion per year. Lomborg challenges the idea that economic growth is inherently bad for the planet, a view held by some academics who advocate for no-growth economies. He argues that reducing income would actually harm people, leading to fewer resources for healthcare, education, and technology, and ultimately trapping people in poverty. He points out that wealthier people live safer, healthier lives, and that reducing global income would likely lead to millions of preventable deaths. He stresses that the most important factors for improving the world aren't related to climate change at all. Instead, investing in education, health, and technology, especially for the world's poorest, is crucial. He believes our focus on climate change has distracted us from these fundamental truths. Lomborg concludes that choosing the path of higher growth, while also addressing climate change with sensible policies, will create a future with greater opportunities and improved well-being for everyone. Chapter 10: How Climate Policy Hurts the Poor. Bjorn Lomborg begins by pointing out a troubling truth. While wealthy nations contribute the most to climate change, it's the world's poorest countries that will suffer the worst consequences. This isn't just unfair, it's a problem because poorer economies often depend on things like farming, which are easily disrupted by changing weather patterns. They're also located in already hot places and simply don't have the money to prepare for or recover from climate-related disasters. While developed countries might see a small dip in their wealth, poorer nations could lose a much larger percentage of their income, potentially 10% or more. Despite this unfairness, Lomborg argues that current climate policies aren't actually helping those who need it most. In fact, they often make things worse, both in rich and poor countries. He questions why we focus so much on cutting carbon when it doesn't address the everyday struggles of people living in poverty. He uses the example of the Philippines and Typhoon Haiyan. After the devastating storm, the world quickly blamed climate change and called for more carbon cuts. But Lomborg points out that similar storms have happened before, and cutting carbon won't stop them entirely. It will only slightly delay the inevitable. Instead, Lomborg suggests focusing on helping vulnerable communities become more resilient. He argues that lifting people out of poverty is the most effective way to protect them from natural disasters. Studies show that as people earn more money, they're better able to invest in things like stronger homes and better infrastructure, which reduces the impact of storms. He illustrates this by comparing the death toll from a hurricane in Tacloban in 1912 to the one in 2013. The older storm killed a much higher percentage of the population because the city was poorer and less prepared. Lomborg believes that if the world had focused on reducing poverty in the Philippines since 1992, hundreds of lives could have been saved during Typhoon Haiyan, far more than any carbon cuts could have achieved. Lomborg contends that climate policies can be actively harmful. He points to the example of biofuels, where crops were grown for fuel instead of food, leading to higher food prices and increased hunger. He also explains how climate policies can drive up energy costs, which disproportionately affects low-income families. In rich countries, poorer households spend a larger portion of their income on energy, so higher prices hit them harder. He uses the United States and the United Kingdom as examples, where rising energy costs are forcing people to make difficult choices about heating their homes. He extends this argument to developing countries, arguing that access to affordable energy is crucial for lifting people out of poverty. He criticizes the focus on expensive renewable energy projects, arguing that fossil fuels are often a more practical and cost-effective solution. He uses Bangladesh as an example, where building coal-fired power plants would provide significant economic benefits, even when accounting for the climate impact. Lomborg highlights that focusing solely on climate change can distract from other important issues like healthcare, education, and nutrition. Lomborg emphasizes that poverty itself is the biggest problem, and that addressing it will have a far greater impact on people's lives than simply trying to slow down climate change. He points out that there are currently around 650 million people living in extreme poverty, and it would cost less than $100 billion a year to lift them out of it. This is a fraction of the trillions of dollars being spent on climate policies that have limited impact. He concludes that we need to shift our focus from ineffective carbon cuts to practical solutions that improve the lives of the world's poorest people. He believes that well-intentioned climate alarmism often leads to policies that do more harm than good, and that it's time to try a different approach. Chapter 11, Carbon Tax, the Market-Based Solution. Bjorn Lomborg argues that the way we're currently trying to fight climate change isn't working very well. He believes that simply adding more solar panels, holding protests, or making bigger promises isn't enough. He thinks we're focusing on quick fixes instead of smart solutions. Lomborg suggests we need to stop rushing into expensive plans without thinking about whether they'll actually make a big difference. The good news, according to Lomborg, is that there are better ways to tackle climate change. He wants us to find solutions that cut emissions without costing too much money and that actually help people. He believes we need to use our creativity and innovation to come up with new ideas. He introduces the idea of 5 key policies that most people could agree on as a more effective approach. Lomborg starts by explaining why a carbon tax is a good idea. A carbon tax is a fee added to things that create carbon dioxide when they're made or used. He explains that when we burn fossil fuels like gas and coal, it releases carbon dioxide, which warms the planet. The people who burn the fuels and the people who buy the products made with those fuels benefit, but everyone shares the problem of a warmer climate. This is unfair, like one person making a mess and everyone else having to clean it up. He uses the example of salmon to illustrate his point. Think about buying a piece of salmon at a restaurant. The price you pay covers the cost of catching the fish, transporting it, and preparing it. But it doesn't include the cost of the pollution created by the boats, planes, and trucks used to get the salmon to your plate. A carbon tax would add a small fee to all of these steps, reflecting the environmental cost. This would encourage everyone involved, the fishermen, the transporters, and even the restaurant, to find ways to reduce emissions. You, as the consumer, might choose frozen salmon instead of fresh, because it creates less pollution and therefore has a lower tax. Lomborg acknowledges that a carbon tax will make things a little more expensive, but he argues that this is a necessary cost. Climate change will also be expensive, causing damage to our environment and economy. The goal is to find a carbon tax level that balances these costs, reducing climate change damage without hurting the economy too much. Lomborg explains that setting the right carbon tax is tricky. If we don't have a tax, we'll suffer the full effects of climate change, which could cost trillions of dollars. But if we set the tax too high, it could significantly slow down economic growth. He uses a model to show that a temperature rise of 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100 would cause about $87 trillion in climate damage, while a carbon tax to achieve that goal would cost $21 trillion. He points out that many people want to aim for even lower temperature increases, like 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit. However, achieving this would require a much higher carbon tax, costing $177 trillion. He argues that the benefits of reducing the temperature further don't outweigh the costs of the higher tax. It's like trying to make something perfect when good enough is actually more practical and affordable. Lomborg stresses that a global carbon tax, applied equally in all countries, would be the most effective approach. However, he recognizes that this is unlikely to happen. Countries often have different priorities and are unwilling to agree on a single tax rate. He predicts that in the real world, carbon taxes will be implemented unevenly and inefficiently, making them more expensive than they need to be. He explains that rich countries tend to make carbon cuts, but these cuts are often more expensive than cuts made in developing countries. Additionally, politicians often choose policies that benefit certain industries or groups, rather than the most efficient solutions. He estimates that these inefficiencies could double the cost of climate policies. Lomborg concludes that a realistic carbon tax can be a good thing, but it's not a magic bullet. It can reduce emissions and limit climate change damage, but its impact will be relatively modest. He believes we need to focus on finding the right balance between reducing climate change and maintaining a healthy economy. He emphasizes that climate change is just one of many challenges facing humanity, and we need to consider the overall well-being of future generations when making policy decisions. He argues that overly ambitious climate policies could actually harm society by diverting resources from other important areas like healthcare and education. Chapter 12, Innovation, What is Needed Most. Bjorn Lomborg argues that the way we're dealing with climate change isn't the best way. He believes that worrying too much and spending huge amounts of money isn't actually helping the planet as much as it could. He points out that we faced big problems before, like when people relied on whale oil for light, and we didn't solve them by telling everyone to use less. Instead, we found new, better ways to do things. He uses the example of whale oil to show how innovation works. Back in the 1700s and 1800s, whale oil was the main source of light. It was a big business, employing many people. People couldn't imagine a world without it, because it was brighter and cleaner than other options. But then, kerosene and electricity came along. People didn't stop using whale oil because they were told to. They switched because the new options were simply better and cheaper. Lomborg believes we should apply the same idea to climate change. Lomborg highlights other historical examples to support his point. He mentions the fear that London would be buried in horse manure because of all the horse-drawn carriages. Instead of banning carriages, the invention of the car solved the problem. He also talks about the smog in Los Angeles and how the invention of the catalytic converter allowed more cars while improving air quality. Even the worry about feeding the world's growing population in the 1960s was overcome by a scientist named Norman Borlaug, who developed new, better kinds of wheat, rice, and corn. These new crops produced more food, preventing widespread starvation. He explains that the current approach to climate change focuses on expensive solutions like solar and wind power. While these are good ideas, Lomborg says they aren't providing enough energy to meet the world's needs. He points out that even with a lot of money and support, they only provide a small part of the world's energy. He believes we should be focusing on finding cheaper, more effective alternatives. Lomborg suggests that fracking, a way to get oil and gas from the ground, is a good example of innovation. While it has some environmental downsides, it has also made energy cheaper and increased the wealth of the United States. He thinks we should look for ways to share this technology with other countries, especially China, which burns a lot of coal. Switching to cheaper gas could significantly reduce carbon dioxide emissions. He emphasizes the importance of investing in research and development, or R&D, for new energy technologies. He suggests that instead of spending trillions of dollars on solar and wind power, we should spend about $100 billion each year on researching new ideas. He believes this would lead to breakthroughs that could make green energy much cheaper and more effective. He compares this to the mission innovation promise made by world leaders, which hasn't been fully kept. Lomborg suggests focusing on areas like energy storage, nuclear energy, and even capturing carbon dioxide directly from the air. He explains that predicting the future is hard, so we shouldn't just focus on the most popular ideas. Instead, we should explore many different possibilities. He uses the example of predictions made before the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, showing how difficult it is to foresee future technologies. He concludes that finding a green energy source that is cheaper than fossil fuels is the key to solving climate change. He believes that by investing in innovation, we can create a better future for everyone without sacrificing economic growth or hurting the world's poorest people. Lomborg's message is that smart investments in new technologies, rather than panic and expensive policies, are the best way to address climate change effectively. Chapter 13, Adaptation, Simple but Effective. Bjorn Lomborg argues that while it's important to address climate change, the way we're doing it now is often wrong and very expensive. He believes that focusing too much on stopping all carbon emissions and not enough on adapting to the changes already happening is a mistake. He points out that even if we do everything perfectly to reduce emissions, the Earth will still get warmer because of past emissions that are already in the atmosphere. Plus, completely stopping emissions isn't realistic anytime soon. Lomborg highlights humanity's amazing ability to adjust to tough conditions. He gives examples of people living in extremely hot deserts, freezing cold areas, and dry plateaus, showing that we're naturally good at dealing with different climates. He also notes that we're getting better at surviving natural disasters, with fewer deaths per person than ever before. This shows we're becoming more resilient. He explains that adapting to a warmer planet simply means reacting sensibly to the changes. For example, as it gets hotter, people will use air conditioners more often, and tourism will shift to cooler places like Finland and Canada. These are natural responses, and they don't require complicated rules or expensive programs. Lomborg emphasizes that many adaptations happen on their own, without needing much help from governments. He contrasts the high costs of trying to cut emissions with the immediate and local benefits of adaptation. While reducing emissions might help the whole world a little bit in the future, adapting can protect people and businesses right away. Businesses often find it makes good sense to adapt. like a chemical company installing extra pumps to deal with lower water levels, or a food company helping farmers use better watering techniques. Farmers in South America already adjust what they grow based on the climate, planting fruits and vegetables in warmer areas and wheat and potatoes in cooler ones. Lomborg believes governments can help adaptation by making it easier, not by forcing people to do things. He suggests improving education, providing information about farming, and making tools like tractors more accessible. Giving farmers access to loans can also help them adapt to changing conditions. He stresses that governments should focus on creating a good system that allows people to get the resources they need, rather than giving out loans directly. He also points out that some adaptations require government action, like building flood defenses and early warning systems for disasters. Protecting vulnerable people, like the elderly, during heat waves is another important role for governments. Lomborg notes that for a long time, talking about adaptation was frowned upon in climate change discussions, with some people thinking it meant giving up on reducing emissions. However, Lomborg argues that adaptation is just as important as reducing emissions. He uses the example of rising sea levels, which have been increasing for 150 years. While this is a concern, people have adapted by protecting coastlines, and it's proven to be a worthwhile investment. Studies show that protecting coastlines is much cheaper than the damage that would occur without protection, and it can save trillions of dollars. He explains that coastal protection doesn't just mean building walls. It can also involve using natural defenses like mangroves, which are plants that grow along coastlines and provide protection from storms. Restoring mangroves is a cost-effective way to protect coastlines and support fisheries. Lomborg also discusses how to deal with increased flooding. He points to the Netherlands as an example of a country that has given room for the river, allowing some areas to flood to protect cities. In Houston, Texas, which has experienced many floods, the city is using a combination of big projects like dams and levees, and smaller solutions like buying out flood-prone properties and creating parks. Planting trees and improving drainage can also help reduce flood damage. He highlights Bangladesh's success in reducing deaths from hurricanes through early warning systems and storm shelters. By investing in these measures, the country has dramatically reduced the number of people killed by hurricanes. Similarly, California has learned to protect itself from wildfires by building fire-resistant homes and managing vegetation. Lomborg concludes that adaptation is a sensible and cost-effective way to deal with climate change. He believes that by focusing on practical solutions and helping people adapt to the changes that are already happening, we can protect lives, livelihoods, and the planet without spending trillions of dollars on unrealistic goals. He suggests that a balanced approach, combining smart adaptation with reasonable efforts to reduce emissions, is the best way forward. Chapter 14, Geoengineering, a Backup Plan. Bjorn Lomborg begins by pointing out that while we know carbon taxes, new technologies, and getting used to a changing climate can help with climate change, we haven't been very successful at making them work well enough. He introduces a different idea, called geoengineering, which is about deliberately changing the Earth's temperature. He admits this is a scary thought because it's something humanity has never tried before, and many of the ideas sound like they come from science fiction. However, he believes it's worth looking into as a backup plan, especially if we can't get other solutions working quickly enough or if a climate disaster seems very close. Lomborg uses the example of the Mount Pinatubo volcano in the Philippines in 1991 to explain how geoengineering could work. When the volcano erupted, it sent a lot of sulfur dioxide into the air. This created a temporary shield that blocked some sunlight, and the Earth's temperature dropped. Scientists are now thinking about ways to copy this effect without the destruction caused by a volcano. One idea is stratospheric aerosol injection, which means spraying tiny particles like sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight. He notes that there are different ways to get these particles up there, like using special guns or airplanes. He acknowledges that people worry this could cause problems, like changing rainfall patterns or harming plants, but scientists are also exploring other options. Another geoengineering idea Lomborg discusses is marine cloud brightening. This involves making clouds over the ocean whiter, so they reflect more sunlight. He explains that ocean waves create tiny salt particles, and clouds form around these particles. By adding more salt particles, scientists hope to create more, smaller water droplets in clouds, making them brighter and more reflective. He describes a design for wind-powered boats that could spray seawater into the air to create these extra salt particles. Lomborg recognizes that many environmentalists are against geoengineering, believing it's too risky or that it will distract us from reducing carbon emissions. He argues that we shouldn't dismiss it without looking into it. He believes there are three main reasons to research geoengineering. First, it might be a cheap and effective way to quickly lower global temperatures. He cites research showing that spending just $9 billion on seawater spraying boats could potentially prevent all the temperature increase expected this century, which is much less than the trillions of dollars it would cost to fix the damage from unchecked warming. Second, if geoengineering is easy and affordable, someone might try it on their own, so we need to understand the risks now. Third, geoengineering is the only option that can quickly lower temperatures if we face a climate emergency. Lomborg points out that unlike cutting carbon emissions, which takes decades to show results, geoengineering could work in weeks, like after a volcanic eruption. He acknowledges that many climate scientists are hesitant about geoengineering, and that support for it increases when people believe their own country will be negatively affected by climate change. He addresses common concerns, such as the possibility of changing rainfall patterns or reducing plant growth, and notes that research so far is actually encouraging, suggesting that the benefits of geoengineering might outweigh the risks in many places. He strongly disagrees with the idea that geoengineering will discourage efforts to reduce carbon emissions, comparing it to dismissing life-saving medical treatments because they allow people to live less healthy lifestyles. He highlights that even under President Obama, the U.S. government recommended researching geoengineering, and that some scientists who felt the Paris Agreement wasn't strong enough also supported research. Lomborg concludes by emphasizing that very little money has been spent on geoengineering research, and that this is a mistake. He suggests starting with tens of millions of dollars and increasing investment to the low billions over time. He stresses that we shouldn't start geoengineering now, but we can't afford to ignore it as a potential backup plan. He believes that exploring this option could be a crucial step in protecting the planet. Chapter 15, Prosperity, the other climate policy we need. Bjorn Lomborg argues that often, the way we talk about fighting climate change misses a really important piece of the puzzle: helping countries become wealthier. He points to Bangladesh and the Netherlands as a perfect example. Both countries are low-lying and face serious flooding risks because of rising sea levels. However, the Netherlands, a rich country, has been able to build amazing defenses like dams and barriers to protect its people. Bangladesh, a poorer country, struggles with yearly floods that cause devastation and loss of life. This shows that having money allows countries to protect themselves from climate change much better. Lomborg explains that simply focusing on cutting carbon emissions isn't enough. He believes that lifting countries out of poverty is a powerful, but often overlooked, way to deal with climate change. He looks at predictions made by scientists for Bangladesh's future. These predictions show that even with different approaches to global emissions, Bangladesh is expected to become much richer by the end of the century. As it gets wealthier, it will be able to afford things like better flood defenses, improved drainage systems, and stronger buildings. He estimates these improvements will cost money up front, but as Bangladesh's economy grows, the cost will become easier to manage. The author highlights that as countries become richer, they can also start to focus more on environmentally friendly solutions. Right now, Bangladesh spends a lot of money subsidizing fossil fuels to provide energy to its citizens. But as incomes rise, they could potentially cut those subsidies and start investing in cleaner energy sources, just like richer countries do. It's easier to afford wind turbines when you're not struggling to simply provide basic energy access. Lomborg suggests that choosing pathways that lead to economic growth for Bangladesh isn't just good for its people. It's also a smart climate policy. Lomborg emphasizes that the goal of any climate change policy should be to make the world a better place for both people and the environment. He acknowledges that policies like carbon taxes and investing in green technology cost money that could be used for other important things, like improving healthcare or education. He argues that investing in development and helping people become more prosperous could actually make them more able to deal with climate change. For example, if people have more money, they can afford air conditioning during heat waves or better heating during cold snaps. He points out that the poorest people are often the most affected by climate change. Often, the struggles of the poor are used as a reason to cut emissions, but Lomborg suggests a different approach. He explains that getting poor people out of poverty makes them less vulnerable to climate impacts. They can afford better hospitals, cooler cities with more parks, and more reliable access to resources. He uses the example of the Netherlands and Bangladesh again, noting that richer countries can afford to protect and even expand natural spaces like wetlands, while poorer countries may be forced to cut down forests just to survive. Lomborg references the work of economist Thomas Schelling, who decades ago questioned whether cutting carbon emissions and adaptation were truly the best way to help poor people, or if simply making them more prosperous would be more effective. A study in Tanzania supports Schelling's idea. It found that the very poorest people were most affected by hotter years, while those slightly less poor had more diverse income sources and were able to cope better. This shows that even a small increase in income can make a big difference in a person's ability to withstand climate shocks. Lomborg concludes that while we shouldn't stop trying to address climate change, we need to carefully consider the costs and benefits of different policies. He believes that one of the most effective things we can do is to focus on helping countries like Bangladesh become wealthier as quickly as possible. He suggests that prosperity itself can be a powerful climate policy, and that focusing on development can lead to a better future for everyone. He argues that sometimes the most effective way to help people adapt to climate change is to help them build better lives. Conclusion: how to make the world a better place. Bjorn Lomborg argues that the way we often talk about climate change is actually holding us back from making the world a truly better place. He believes focusing only on climate change is a mistake, especially when so many other big problems need our attention too. He explains that looking at the big picture, things are generally improving for people around the world. Things like pollution, inequality, and hunger are all getting better. But climate change, while important, isn't the biggest challenge we face. Lomborg points out that people are often really scared about climate change, with some even believing it could lead to the end of the world. He reminds us that this isn't the first time people have predicted disaster. Back in the 1960s and 70s, many scientists thought the planet was doomed because of overpopulation and pollution. A scientist named Paul Ehrlich famously predicted billions would die from starvation by the 1980s, but he was completely wrong. Lomborg uses this as an example to show how panic can lead to bad ideas and even harmful policies. In that era, the fear of overpopulation led to some very troubling suggestions, like secretly adding chemicals to food to control birth rates and even forced sterilizations in some countries. The author explains that when we panic, we tend to focus on the wrong things. He uses the example of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which raised concerns about dangerous chemicals like DDT. While Carson was right to point out problems with how these chemicals were used, the fear that followed led to spending huge amounts of money on regulations that didn't actually save many lives. A study found that some regulations cost millions of dollars for each life they saved, while other, more effective safety measures were ignored. Lomborg argues that we're making a similar mistake with climate change spending a lot of money on solutions that aren't very effective while neglecting other important issues. Lomborg believes a climate-industrial complex is forming, similar to how the military benefited from fears during the Cold War. He explains that while some people genuinely want to fight climate change, others, like companies in the renewable energy sector, stand to make a lot of money from climate policies. He points out that companies often lobby for regulations that will increase their profits, and sometimes even exaggerate the dangers of climate change to get what they want. He also notes that environmental groups can unintentionally help companies by creating a sense of crisis that drives demand for expensive, green solutions. The author stresses that the goal of climate policy should be to make the world better, not just to reduce temperatures. He argues that we need to consider all the ways we can improve people's lives, not just focus on climate change. He suggests investing in things like free trade, healthcare, education, and fighting diseases like tuberculosis and malaria. He presents research showing that these investments could generate much greater benefits for humanity than many current climate policies. For example, he explains that investing in contraception access could save hundreds of thousands of lives and boost economic growth in developing countries. Lomborg concludes that we need to be realistic about climate change and avoid panic. He believes we should pursue smart climate policies, but also recognize that there are other, more effective ways to make the world a better place. He urges us to make informed choices and prioritize investments that will have the biggest positive impact on people's lives, both now and in the future. He believes that by focusing on a broader range of challenges, we can create a more prosperous and sustainable world for everyone. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.